In a smoke-filled roadside bar outside Phoenix, Martha's hands trembled as her husband slammed his empty bottle on the scarred wooden counter. "1 bottle of top-shelf whiskey," Ray slurred to the bartender, his grip tightening on her wrist. "And I'll throw in my wife here as part of the deal." The bar erupted in cruel laughter. Martha's eyes filled with shame as strangers leered at her bruised face. Then the laughter died. A lone Hell's Angels rider at the far end of the bar slowly stood up. His leather vest bore the patches of a man who'd seen real war. Without a word, he walked over and placed a $100 bill on the counter. "I'll take her," he said quietly, his steel-gray eyes never leaving Ray's face. "But not as a trade, as my wife. But what kind of man makes such a bold claim in front of a room full of strangers?" Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. Martha Elizabeth Hayes had once believed in fairy tales. 23 years ago, she had walked down the aisle of St. Mary's Methodist Church in her grandmother's ivory dress, clutching a bouquet of wildflowers picked from the meadow behind her childhood home. The congregation had smiled as she promised to love, honor, and cherish Raymond Michael Hayes until death do them part. She had meant every word. The woman who now sat hunched over a cup of cold coffee in this God-forsaken roadside bar bore little resemblance to that hopeful bride. Her auburn hair, once her pride, hung limp and unwashed around a face marked by years of careful concealment. Foundation couldn't quite hide the yellow-green bruise along her jawline, and she kept her sleeves pulled down to cover the finger-shaped marks on her forearms. Her wedding ring caught the dim neon light as she twisted it nervously around her finger. The simple gold band had grown loose over the years as worry and fear had stolen her appetite and her curves. Ray used to tell her she was getting too skinny, that real men liked women with meat on their bones. Then he would grab her roughly, his hands leaving bruises that she would later explain away as clumsiness to the few people who still bothered to ask. Martha had been a teacher once, 3rd grade at Millfield Elementary, where she had spent her days nurturing young minds and helping children discover the magic of reading. She remembered the feeling of purpose that came with watching a struggling student finally grasp a difficult concept, the joy of seeing their faces light up with understanding. Those children had looked at her with trust and admiration, seeing her as someone safe, someone who cared. That life felt like something from another century now. Ray had started small, suggesting she didn't need to work when they were first married. He made good money at the construction company, he said. What would people think if they couldn't afford for his wife to stay home? The suggestion had become insistence, then demand, then ultimatum. By the time she realized what she had given up, the school had filled her position, and Ray had made sure she understood that her teaching days were over. The isolation had crept in slowly, like water seeping through a crack in a foundation. First it was her college friends who lived too far away anyway. Then her work colleagues, who Ray claimed were filling her head with feminist nonsense. Her sister Sarah had been the hardest loss. But after Ray's explosive reaction to her suggestion that Martha might want to visit for the weekend, even that relationship had withered under the weight of his jealousy and control. Her mother had tried in her gentle way to reach out over the years, but Ray monitored the phone calls, standing close enough to hear both sides of the conversation, making his presence known through heavy sighs and meaningful glares. Eventually, even Martha's mother had stopped calling, perhaps sensing that her daughter's silence spoke louder than any words of reassurance. The bruises had started during their 3rd year of marriage. Ray's drinking had increased after he lost his foreman position at work, and with it went his last pretense of self-control. The first time he hit her, he had been immediately remorseful, crying and begging forgiveness, promising it would never happen again. Martha had wanted so desperately to believe him that she had convinced herself it was an aberration, a moment of weakness brought on by stress and alcohol. But promises, she had learned, were as fragile as the cheap glass ornaments Ray liked to throw against the wall during his rages. The violence had escalated gradually, each incident a little worse than the last, each apology a little less convincing. He had been careful never to mark her face where others might see, at least not at first. But as their isolation grew complete and his drinking worsened, even that consideration had fallen away. Martha had tried to leave twice. The first time, she had made it as far as her sister's house in Tucson before Ray tracked her down, appearing on Sarah's doorstep with flowers and tears, spinning a story about a misunderstanding and his desperation to get his beloved wife back. The second time, she had gotten a room at a women's shelter, but Ray had found her there too, somehow convincing the staff that he was a changed man seeking counseling. Both times, the punishment for her attempted escape had been swift and brutal. After the second time, Ray had made it clear that there would not be a third chance. He knew people, he said, people who could make sure she disappeared if she ever tried to leave him again. And Martha, broken and terrified, had finally stopped trying. Now sitting in this bar that smelled of stale beer and broken dreams, she fingered the thin gold band that had become more shackle than symbol. She had long since stopped believing in rescue or redemption. She had accepted that this was her life, that she would endure until she could endure no more. Marcus Thompson had learned to read people the way other men read newspapers. 38 years of life, 12 of them in the Marines, had taught him that survival often depended on knowing who meant harm before they made their move. The woman sitting 3 stools down from him radiated pain like heat from a forge, and the drunk beside her stank of meanness and barely contained violence. The dog tags beneath his leather vest pressed against his chest as he shifted on the bar stool, a reminder of the man he used to be. Staff Sergeant Marcus Steele Thompson, Force Reconnaissance, 2 tours in Afghanistan, 1 in Iraq. The tags bore witness to a different life, one where his silence had been tactical rather than defensive, where his watchfulness had kept his brothers alive instead of keeping the world at arm's length. His hands, scarred from countless motorcycle repairs and more than a few fights, remained steady around his beer bottle. Those same hands had once operated radio equipment under enemy fire, had applied tourniquets to wounded Marines, had held dying boys while they called for their mothers. Now they built custom motorcycles in his garage and asked nothing from the world except to be left alone. The Hells Angels patch on his back told its own story. The club had found him 6 years ago, drunk and hollow-eyed in a VA hospital parking lot, trying to work up the courage to walk through the doors and ask for help he wasn't sure he deserved. Roadkill, the chapter president, had taken one look at him and made a simple offer: "Come ride with us, see if the wind helps." It had been the closest thing to salvation Marcus had experienced since coming home. The Brotherhood was different from his Marine unit, but it scratched the same itch. These men understood loyalty without explanation, brotherhood without questions, and the kind of silence that came from seeing too much. They didn't ask about his nightmares or why he sometimes woke up reaching for weapons that weren't there. They just handed him a wrench and pointed him toward a broken bike, trusting that working with his hands might help fix what was broken inside. His reputation in the club was built on reliability rather than recklessness. While other members sought glory in bar fights and highway stunts, Marcus had earned his respect through steady competence and unshakable loyalty. When the club needed someone to watch their backs during a difficult negotiation, they called Steele. When a member's family needed protection from creditors or ex-husbands, Steele got the call. He was the club's quiet guardian, the one who handled problems before they became crises. The silence that had once been tactical had become personal after Kandahar. His squad had been ambushed during what should have been a routine patrol, caught in a kill zone that turned 12 good Marines into scattered memories and grief that followed him home. Marcus had been the only survivor, pulled unconscious from the wreckage with a Purple Heart's worth of shrapnel in his back and the weight of 12 ghosts on his shoulders. The doctors had patched his body, but the invisible wounds had festered. He had tried civilian life, tried college on the GI Bill, tried dating women who smiled too much and talked about feelings he couldn't access. Everything felt hollow, like he was watching his life through bulletproof glass. The only time he felt real was when he was moving, when the highway stretched endlessly ahead and the rumble of his Harley drowned out the voices in his head. Women had come and gone, attracted initially by the dangerous appeal of the leather vest and the motorcycle, then fleeing when they realized the man inside was more ghost than rebel. He had stopped trying to explain why he couldn't sleep through the night, why crowded spaces made him sweat, why he sometimes heard explosions that weren't there. It was easier to be alone, easier to love only his bike and his brothers and the open road. But the woman at the bar had caught his attention in a way that surprised him. She wasn't looking for excitement or trying to tame a wild man. She was just trying to survive, and something in her careful stillness reminded him of the wounded animals he used to find as a child. Creatures that had learned that movement meant pain and stillness, meant another day of life. When her husband had made his obscene proposal, something had shifted inside Marcus's chest, like a lock clicking open after years of being sealed shut. The words had come out before he could stop them, a promise made to a stranger that felt more binding than any oath he had ever sworn. He didn't understand why this broken woman mattered to him, but standing here now, watching her husband's face turn purple with rage, he knew he would kill or die before he let anyone hurt her again. The Crossroads Bar had earned its name honestly. Built at the intersection of Highway 87 and a forgotten farm road that led nowhere important, it served as a way station for travelers who had lost their direction in more ways than one. The building itself was a testament to functional ugliness. Constructed from cinder blocks and good intentions sometime in the 1960s, when the highway still carried hope along with traffic, Jake Morelli had owned the place for 15 years. Inheriting it from his uncle along with a mortgage that never seemed to shrink and a clientele that paid in stories as often as cash. The neon open sign in the window flickered intermittently, casting red shadows across the cracked asphalt parking lot. Jake had been meaning to fix it for 3 years, but somehow the broken light seemed appropriate for the kind of establishment he ran. Inside, the bar stretched along one wall like a wooden altar to lost causes. The mirror behind it was cracked in 2 places, creating a fractured reflection that seemed fitting for the people who sought solace in its dim interior. Mismatched bar stools lined up like supplicants, their vinyl seats patched with duct tape in various colors. The air hung thick with decades of cigarette smoke, despite the state ban that had gone into effect years ago. Some smells, Jake had learned, became part of the building itself. The Crossroads attracted a particular type of customer, long-haul truckers who needed something stronger than coffee to wash the road dust from their throats. Divorce refugees nursing their wounds in whiskey and self-pity. Veterans who couldn't quite adjust to civilian life, drawn by Jake's own Marine Corps tattoo and his understanding silence. Construction workers cashing checks that were already spent before they earned them. And bikers, always bikers, who treated the place as neutral ground where club colors meant less than personal honor. Jake had established rules over the years, unwritten laws that kept his establishment from becoming another roadhouse crime scene. No drugs changed hands under his roof. Weapons stayed holstered or sheathed unless someone's life was genuinely threatened. Women were treated with respect, regardless of how they earned their living or who they arrived with. And most importantly, what happened at the Crossroads stayed at the Crossroads. The jukebox in the corner played a rotating selection of country classics and rock ballads, songs about broken hearts and second chances that provided the soundtrack to a dozen personal dramas each night. Hank Williams and Johnny Cash understood the clientele better than any therapist ever could. The pool table in the back room had seen more confessions than most Catholic churches. Its felt surface witness to whispered secrets shared over games that nobody really cared about winning. Regular customers had their own assigned seats, territories marked by habit rather than hostility. Old Pete claimed a corner stool every evening from 6 to 9, nursing a single beer while he told anyone who would listen about his glory days as a minor league pitcher. Maria, A waitress from the truck stop down the road stopped by after her late shifts to drink wine from a coffee cup and text her daughter who lived 3 states away. Tommy the mechanic held court at the far end of the bar, dispensing automotive wisdom and relationship advice with equal authority and questionable accuracy. The Crossroads had witnessed its share of human drama over the years. Jake had seen men drink away their fortunes and their families, had watched women discover strength they never knew they possessed, had observed the delicate dance of people trying to connect across the vast distances that life had carved between them. He had learned when to listen and when to mind his own business, when to cut someone off and when to let them find their own bottom. Tonight felt different, though. Jake had developed an instinct for trouble during his years behind the bar, and the tension in the room was thick enough to slice. The drunk and his wife radiated dysfunction like a toxic cloud, while the lone biker at the end of the bar watched everything with the focused intensity of a predator. Jake had seen enough bar fights to recognize the signs, but something about this situation felt larger than a simple altercation. The flickering neon sign outside cast its broken light across a scene that would change 4 lives forever. In a place where people came to escape their stories, tonight would write a new chapter for everyone present. The Crossroads had always been a place where destinies intersected, but Jake sensed that this particular intersection might require him to choose sides in a way he had never done before. The silence that followed Marcus's declaration stretched like a taut wire ready to snap. Every conversation in the bar had died, every pool cue had stilled, every breath had been held as the weight of his words settled over the room like smoke from a distant fire. Martha felt her heart hammering against her ribs as she stared at this stranger who had just claimed her as his wife, with the calm certainty of a man stating the weather. Ray's face had cycled through confusion, disbelief, and was now settling into the familiar, red-faced fury that Martha knew preceded his worst moments. His grip on her wrist tightened until she could feel her bones grinding together, but she didn't make a sound. Years of experience had taught her that any reaction would only make things worse. "You think this is funny?" Ray's voice cracked with alcohol and outrage. "You think you can just walk over here and take what's mine?" He swayed slightly, the whiskey making him bolder than wisdom would advise. "This is my wife, you leather-wearing freak, mine. I own her. Bought and paid for with 23 years of putting a roof over her head and food in her mouth." Marcus removed his leather jacket with deliberate slowness, the movement causing every man in the bar to shift nervously. The jacket was worn black leather, soft with age and use, bearing patches that told stories of roads traveled and brotherhood earned. As he placed it gently around Martha's shoulders, she felt its warmth seep through her thin dress. The first genuine comfort she had experienced in longer than she could remember. "She's not property," Marcus said quietly, his voice carrying the kind of authority that came from leading men in life or death situations. "And she's not yours anymore." He turned to face Martha, his steel-grey eyes meeting hers with an intensity that made her breath catch. "Ma'am, I know this seems sudden, but I'm offering you a choice. You can stay with him and nothing changes, or you can come with me and start over. Either way, nobody's trading you for anything ever again." Martha felt something crack open inside her chest, a sensation she hadn't experienced since her teaching days, when a struggling student finally grasped a difficult concept. This stranger was offering her something she had stopped believing existed: choice, agency, the possibility that her life could be something other than an endurance test. You can't just steal another man's wife. Ray lurched forward, his hand reaching for the knife he always carried on his belt. "I'll cut you open and watch you bleed out on this floor." The change in Marcus was instantaneous. One moment he was a calm man making a reasonable offer. The next, he was a coiled predator whose entire body had shifted into a fighting stance that spoke of professional training and hard-won experience. His hand moved to intercept Ray's wrist with surgical precision, applying pressure to nerve points that made the drunk cry out in pain and drop his weapon. "I served 2 tours in Afghanistan," Marcus said conversationally, his grip never loosening on Ray's wrist. "I've killed men who were better trained, better armed, and significantly more sober than you are right now. So let me make this simple. The lady is going to make her choice, and you're going to respect it. Or we can step outside and discuss your objections in a more private setting." Jake the bartender had his hand on the shotgun he kept beneath the register, but something in Marcus's demeanor told him this situation was under control. The other patrons watched with the fascination of people witnessing a car accident, unable to look away but wise enough to stay out of the way. Martha pulled the leather jacket tighter around her shoulders, feeling its weight like armor against the world. For the first time in years, someone was treating her like a human being worthy of respect and protection. The jacket smelled like motor oil and leather, and something indefinably masculine that wasn't threatening or possessive, but simply present. "I'll go with you," she whispered, the words barely audible in the charged atmosphere of the bar. Then louder, with more conviction than she had felt in decades. "I choose 23 to go with you." Ray's face contorted with rage and disbelief. "Martha, you get back here right now. You're my wife. You promised to obey me." But Martha was already standing, the leather jacket hanging loose on her small frame, but somehow making her feel larger, stronger, more substantial than she had in years. She looked at her husband of 23 years and saw him clearly for perhaps the first time, a small, mean man whose power had come entirely from her willingness to surrender it. Martha's torn dress caught on the bar stool as she stood, the fabric ripping further with the sound that seemed to echo through the silent bar. The dress had once been blue, a cheerful cornflower shade that she had chosen years ago when she still believed that pretty clothes might make her feel pretty again. Now it hung in tatters, stained with spilled beer and marked with the evidence of Ray's rough handling. Each tear in the fabric told a story of violence and degradation that she was finally ready to leave behind. "You walk out that door with him and you're dead to me." Ray's voice cracked with desperation and rage. "You hear me, Martha? Dead. You got nowhere to go, nobody who wants you. You think this biker trash is gonna take care of you? He'll use you up and throw you away, just like every other man you ever meet." Marcus moved with the fluid precision of someone accustomed to dangerous situations, positioning himself between Martha and her husband, while keeping his movements non-threatening to the other bar patrons. His presence radiated a calm authority that made Ray's bluster seem even more pathetic by comparison. "Mom," Marcus said softly, his voice pitched only for Martha's ears, "we can walk out of here right now and you never have to see him again. But once we leave, there's no going back. Are you sure this is what you want?" Martha looked down at her torn dress, at the bruises on her arms that were already turning purple in the dim bar light, at the wedding ring that had become nothing more than a golden chain around her finger. She thought about the woman she used to be, the teacher who had inspired children and dreamed of making a difference in the world. That woman had been buried under years of fear and control, but maybe she wasn't dead. Maybe she was just waiting for someone to offer her a way out. "I'm sure," she said, surprised by the steadiness in her own voice. "I want to leave." Ray lunged forward, desperation overriding what little sense the alcohol had left him. "She's my wife. You can't just steal her. I'll call the cops. I'll have you arrested for kidnapping." Jake the bartender finally spoke up, his voice carrying the authority of a man who had seen too much drama in his establishment. "Ray, the lady made her choice. You keep carrying on like this, and I'll be the one calling the cops. About that unpaid tab you've been running for 3 months?" The threat hit home. Ray's face went pale beneath his whiskey flush as he calculated debts he couldn't pay and consequences he couldn't afford. His bluster deflated like a punctured tire, leaving behind only the sad reality of a man whose wife had just chosen a stranger over him. Marcus placed a gentle hand on Martha's elbow, guiding her toward the door with the careful attention of someone leading a wounded animal to safety. "My bike's outside," he said quietly. "I know you're scared, but I promise you're safe now." Martha's legs felt unsteady as they walked across the sticky barroom floor. past tables full of people who watched their progress with the fascination reserved for live entertainment. She could feel their eyes on her torn dress, her bruised face, her obvious terror. But for the first time in years, the attention didn't feel predatory. It felt like witness to her liberation. Martha. Ray's voice followed them across the bar, high and desperate now. "You come back here? You can't make it without me. You got no money, no job, nowhere to go. You'll be begging me to take you back within a week." The words hit their target, awakening the familiar voice of doubt that had kept her trapped for so long. Maybe Ray was right. Maybe she was making a terrible mistake. Maybe this stranger would abandon her the moment he realized what damaged goods he had claimed. Maybe she would end up worse off than before. But then Marcus's hand touched hers, warm and steady and completely without demand. "One step at a time," he murmured. "That's all we need to do. Just keep walking." The bar door opened with a rusty squeal, letting in a blast of cool desert air that carried the scent of sage and freedom. Martha stepped across the threshold and felt something shift inside her chest, as if chains she hadn't even known she was wearing had suddenly fallen away. Behind her, Ray's voice rose to a desperate howl, but the sound seemed to come from another world, another life that no longer had any claim on her. Outside, under a sky full of stars she hadn't bothered to notice in years, Martha took her first breath as a woman who belonged to no one but herself. The ride to Marcus's cabin took 43 minutes along winding mountain roads that Martha had never seen before. She pressed herself against his back on the Harley, feeling the rumble of the engine through her entire body as they climbed into hills that seemed to rise like protective walls around them. The wind whipped through her hair, carrying away the stale smoke of the bar and the lingering echo of Ray's threats. For the first time in years, she felt like she could breathe. Marcus's cabin sat in a clearing surrounded by ponderosa pines, their tall trunks standing like silent sentinels in the moonlight. The structure was simple but well-maintained, built from logs that had weathered to a silver gray that blended seamlessly with the shadows. Solar panels on the roof caught the starlight, and a small generator hummed quietly beside a neat stack of split firewood. Everything about the place spoke of careful preparation and self-sufficiency. He helped her off the bike with the same gentle consideration he had shown in the bar, his hands steadying her without lingering or presuming. Martha's legs trembled from the ride and the adrenaline that was finally beginning to fade, leaving her feeling hollow and uncertain. The reality of what she had done was beginning to sink in. She had left her husband for a man she didn't know, abandoned the only life she had known for 2 decades to follow a stranger into the mountains. "Second thoughts?" Marcus asked quietly, reading her expression with the same accuracy he had demonstrated earlier. His voice held no judgment, only understanding and the implicit promise that her answer would be respected, whatever it might be. Martha looked back down the mountain road they had traveled, then at the cabin that represented an unknown future. The brass key in Marcus's hand caught the porch light, a simple piece of metal that somehow represented the possibility of sanctuary she hadn't believed existed. "No," she said, surprised by her own certainty. "No second thoughts." Marcus unlocked the front door and gestured for her to enter first, a courtesy that struck her as both old-fashioned and revolutionary. When had Ray last opened a door for her, or asked her preference about anything? She stepped across the threshold into a space that felt immediately different from any home she had known. The interior was spartanly furnished, but comfortable, with handmade wooden furniture that showed the marks of careful craftsmanship. A stone fireplace dominated one wall, flanked by bookshelves filled with volumes on everything from motorcycle maintenance to military history. The kitchen was small but functional, with copper pots hanging from hooks and herbs growing in small pots on the windowsill. Everything was clean and organized without being obsessive, the home of a man who valued simplicity and order. "The bedroom's through there," Marcus said, nodding toward a door off the main room. "Bathroom's attached. You can lock the door if it makes you feel safer. I'll sleep out here on the couch." The offer of privacy and security, made without expectation or ulterior motive, nearly brought Martha to tears. She realized she had been bracing herself for demands, for the inevitable price that would come due for her rescue. In her experience, men always wanted something, always expected payment in one form or another for any kindness they showed. But Marcus simply handed her the key and stepped back, giving her space to make her own choices. "There's clothes in the dresser," he continued, his tone matter-of-fact. "My sister left some things here last time she visited. Might fit you better than what you're wearing. And there's food in the kitchen if you're hungry." Martha looked down at her torn dress, suddenly aware of how she must appear. Disheveled, bruised, wearing the evidence of her humiliation like a scarlet letter. But when she met Marcus's eyes, she saw no judgment there, no pity or disgust. Just quiet acceptance and impatience that seemed infinite. Why? She asked, the question that had been building inside her since the moment he had spoken up in the bar. "Why did you help me? You don't even know me." Marcus was quiet for a long moment, staring out the window at the dark forest beyond. When he finally spoke, his voice carried the weight of old pain and hard-won wisdom. "Because everybody deserves a chance to start over," he said simply. "Because nobody should have to live in fear. And because sometimes we get opportunities to do the right thing. And what kind of man would I be if I walked away from that?" The brass key felt warm in Martha's palm as she closed her fingers around it, a tangible symbol of the sanctuary she had found in the most unlikely of places. Martha woke to the sound of coffee brewing and the unfamiliar sensation of sunlight streaming through clean windows. For a moment, panic seized her as she struggled to remember where she was and why Ray wasn't shaking her awake with demands for breakfast. Then the events of the previous night came flooding back, and she felt something she hadn't experienced in years, relief at waking up. The bedroom Marcus had given her was simple but peaceful, with whitewashed walls and furniture made from what looked like reclaimed barnwood. On the dresser she had found clothes that belonged to his sister, soft jeans, cotton shirts, and a warm cardigan that smelled faintly of lavender. For the first time in decades, she had slept through the night without waking to check if Ray was in one of his moods. Among her few belongings from the bar, she had found something she thought was lost forever. Her grandmother's wooden cross, hand-carved by her grandfather during the Depression, had somehow survived Ray's periodic purges of her possessions. The cross was simple, hewn from oak and worn smooth by decades of handling during prayers and moments of desperation. Finding it felt like a sign, a connection to the woman she used to be and the faith she had thought was dead. When she emerged from the bedroom, Marcus was standing at the kitchen stove, bacon sizzling in a cast-iron pan. He had traded his leather vest for a simple flannel shirt, and she could see how the domestic setting transformed him from dangerous biker to something approaching normal. But his awareness remained constant. She noticed how he positioned himself to keep the door in sight, how his shoulders never fully relaxed, even in his own home. "Sleep okay?" he asked without turning around, giving her space to adjust to his presence without feeling watched or judged. "Better than I have in years," Martha admitted, surprised by her own honesty. She clutched the wooden cross, running her thumb over its familiar surface. "I found this in my things. I thought Ray had thrown it away." Marcus glanced at the cross, his expression softening slightly. "Your grandmother's? My grandfather made it for her when they were courting. She gave it to me when I got married, said it would protect me." Martha's voice caught slightly. "I guess it took a while to work. Maybe it was waiting for the right moment," Marcus said quietly, sliding eggs onto 2 plates. "Sometimes protection comes in ways we don't expect." They ate breakfast in comfortable silence, punctuated by small conversations about simple things. The weather, the wildlife that visited his bird feeders, the garden he maintained behind the cabin. Martha found herself relaxing in a way she had forgotten was possible, her shoulders gradually unclenching as she realized that Marcus had no agenda, no demands, no expectation that she perform gratitude or affection in exchange for his kindness. After breakfast, he showed her around the property, The cabin sat on 5 acres of mountain land, with a workshop where he built custom motorcycles and a small barn that housed his tools and equipment. Everything was meticulously organized, a reflection of military discipline applied to civilian life. But there were softer touches too. Wind chimes that sang in the breeze, a vegetable garden with tomatoes and peppers, birdhouses hanging from the pine trees. "I built this place after I got out," Marcus said, as they walked past a stack of lumber that would eventually become an addition to the workshop. "Needed somewhere quiet to figure out who I was when I wasn't wearing a uniform." "Did you figure it out?" Martha asked, genuinely curious about this man who had upended her life with a single act of intervention. Marcus was quiet for a long moment, his eyes focused on the distant mountains. "Still working on it," he admitted, "but I'm closer than I was." As the day wore on, Martha found herself sharing pieces of her story that she had never told anyone. Her dreams of teaching, her love of literature, the way she used to write poetry in secret notebooks that Ray eventually found and burned. Marcus listened without trying to fix anything, without offering advice or judgment. He simply heard her, perhaps the first person to truly listen to her voice in longer than she could remember. In return, he offered glimpses of his own journey, the brotherhood he had found in the Marines, the weight of losing his entire squad, the way civilian life had felt like wearing clothes that didn't fit. He showed her photographs of his sister and her children, talked about the Hells Angels Club members who had become his chosen family, described the satisfaction of building something beautiful with his hands. The wooden cross remained in Martha's pocket throughout the day, a tangible reminder of faith and family and the possibility that even the most broken things could be made whole. Again, the rumble of approaching motorcycles shattered the peaceful morning quiet. 3 days after Martha's arrival at the cabin, she looked up from the vegetable garden where she had been pulling weeds, her heart immediately racing with the familiar fear that had become second nature over the years. But Marcus, who was splitting wood nearby, simply set down his axe and dusted off his hands with the calm confidence of a man expecting friends rather than trouble. "It's okay," he said, reading her expression. "Just the club coming to check on things." 5 Harleys pulled into the clearing, their riders dismounting with the easy familiarity of men who had ridden together for years. Martha recognized the type immediately. Hard men with weathered faces and careful eyes, the kind who had learned to read situations quickly and react accordingly. Their leather vests bore the patches and colors of the Hells Angels, and she could feel their assessment of her as they removed their helmets and gloves. The man who appeared to be their leader stepped forward first. He was older than Marcus, maybe 55, with steel-grey hair pulled back in a ponytail and arms covered in tattoos that told stories of military service and motorcycle clubs. The charter document folded in his vest pocket identified him as a founding member, someone whose word carried weight in the Brotherhood. "Steele," the man said, using Marcus's road name. "Heard you had some excitement at the crossroads the other night. Thought we'd ride up and see how you're settling in." Marcus nodded toward Martha, who stood frozen beside the tomato plants like a deer caught in headlights. "Roadkill, this is Martha. Martha, meet Roadkill, our chapter president. And these ugly bastards are Tank, Preacher, Wolf, and Diesel." The introductions were made with the casual courtesy of men who understood the importance of respect and protocol. Each member nodded politely to Martha, but she could see the questions in their eyes. This was unprecedented behavior from their brother Steele, the loner who had never brought a woman to club gatherings, let alone claimed one as his wife in a public bar. "Mind if we talk privately for a minute?" Roadkill asked Marcus, his tone suggesting it wasn't really a request. Marcus glanced at Martha, who nodded quickly and retreated toward the cabin. She could hear the murmur of conversation from the porch, too low to make out specific words, but intense enough to understand that her presence was being discussed and evaluated. The weight of their scrutiny pressed down on her like a physical force, reminding her of how precarious her new situation really was. Tank, a mountain of a man with hands like sledgehammers. was the first to voice concerns that the others shared. "Brother, you know we got your back no matter what, but this is moving pretty fast. 3 days ago you were riding solo. Now you got a wife we never met?" "She was being sold like livestock," Marcus replied quietly, his voice carrying the edge that meant the discussion was approaching dangerous territory, by a drunk who had been beating her for years. "What was I supposed to do? Walk away?" Preacher, whose nickname came from his habit of quoting scripture at inappropriate moments, leaned against his bike and studied Martha through the cabin window. "Noble intentions, Steele, but good intentions don't always lead to good outcomes. What do you know about her? Could be she's running a con. Could be she's got enemies following her trail. Could be she's exactly what she appears to be," Marcus countered. "A woman who needed help and got it. Wolf, the club's enforcer, and a man whose reputation for violence was well-earned, spoke with the bluntness that had made him valuable in negotiations with rival clubs. Problem is, this affects all of us now. You claim her as your old lady, she becomes part of the family. That means we're all responsible for protecting her, and we're all vulnerable if she brings trouble to our door." The conversation continued for nearly an hour, with each member expressing variations of the same concerns. They had seen brothers make impulsive decisions about women before, had watched relationships tear apart the careful bonds that held the club together. Their skepticism wasn't personal. It was protective, born from experience and genuine care for their brother's well-being. Finally, Diesel, the youngest member of the group, offered a perspective that carried weight because of his reputation for careful judgment. "Look, Steele's never steered us wrong before. If he says she's worth protecting, maybe we should trust his instincts. But we keep our eyes open, watch for problems, and deal with them if they surface." The charter document in Roadkill's pocket rustled as he shifted position, a reminder of the oaths they had all sworn to support each other through whatever challenges arose. In the end, brotherhood meant accepting your brother's choices, even when you questioned them, standing together even when you stood apart. Ray Hayes had sobered up enough to realize that losing Martha meant losing more than just a wife. Without her Social Security disability check from the back injury she'd sustained in a car accident years ago, without her careful management of their meager finances, without her presence to blame for his failures, he was left with nothing but empty bottles and mounting debts. The crumpled divorce papers on his kitchen table mocked him with their legal language and official seals, documents Martha had filed months ago but never had the courage to serve. He had spent 2 weeks drinking his way through what little money remained in their joint account, calling in favors from men whose friendship was measured in unpaid bar tabs and shared grievances. Ray's world was populated by the kind of people who thrived on other people's misery, who found entertainment in domestic drama and saw women as property to be traded or stolen, depending on the circumstances. Tommy Briggs, a thin man with prison tattoos and a reputation for finding people who didn't want to be found, had been Ray's drinking partner for years. He knew people who knew people, had connections in the kind of businesses that operated on the margins of legality. For $50 and a bottle of whiskey, Tommy had made some calls and gathered information that Ray couldn't have obtained on his own. "Your old lady's been seen up in the mountains," Tommy reported over beers at a different bar, one that didn't have Jake's protective policies, riding behind some Hells Angels prospect on a Harley. "They got a place up near Prescott, real secluded. Word is the guy's ex-military, thinks he's some kind of white knight." The information burned in Ray's chest like acid reflux. The idea that Martha, his Martha, was living with another man made his vision blur with rage. He had owned her for 23 years, had molded her into exactly what he wanted, had broken her down until she was completely dependent on him. The thought that she might be happy, might be healing, might be remembering who she used to be before he got his hands on her, was intolerable. "We're going to get her back," Ray declared, his words slurring slightly despite his attempts to stay sober enough to plan. "Gonna show this biker trash what happens when you steal another man's property." Tommy looked skeptical. "Ray, these Hells Angels guys don't mess around." You go up there looking for trouble, you might find more than you can handle. But Ray was beyond rational thought. The divorce papers represented an unacceptable loss of control, a rejection that struck at the core of his identity. Without Martha to dominate and terrorize, he was forced to confront the emptiness of his own life. And that reflection was more than his fragile ego could bear. He began planning his approach with the kind of obsessive focus he usually reserved for drinking. Ray knew Martha's weaknesses, knew exactly which buttons to push to make her crumble. He would remind her of her obligations, of the vows she had sworn before God and witnesses. He would threaten the consequences that would follow if she didn't come home immediately. And if words failed, he had other methods of persuasion. The restraining order Martha had filed along with the divorce papers was just a piece of paper, Ray told himself. Courts couldn't protect her if they didn't know where she was, and besides, he knew how to make his threats in ways that skirted the edges of legal language. He had learned over the years how to terrorize without quite crossing lines that would land him in jail. Ray's plan was simple in its brutality. He would drive up to the mountains with Tommy and a couple of other drinking buddies, men who owed him favors or shared his views about women who got too big for their britches. They would surround the cabin, overwhelm any resistance, and take Martha back where she belonged. The biker could try to stop them, but Ray had numbers and surprise on his side. What Ray didn't understand was that Marcus Thompson wasn't just any biker. The military training that had kept him alive through 2 combat tours hadn't faded with civilian life, and the protective instincts that had made him legendary among his Marine brothers had found a new focus in the broken woman who was slowly remembering how to smile. The divorce papers lay crumpled and forgotten on Ray's table as he loaded his truck with rope, duct tape, and the kind of tools that had no legitimate purpose in a domestic dispute. In his alcohol-addled mind, he was simply reclaiming what belonged to him. In reality, he was driving toward a confrontation that would test everything Marcus had learned about protecting the people who mattered most. Martha had been living at the cabin for 3 weeks when she accidentally knocked over a box while cleaning Marcus's workshop. The contents spilled across the concrete floor. Photographs, letters, and a small velvet case that fell open to reveal a heart-shaped medal hanging from a purple and white ribbon. She recognized it immediately from her grandfather's similar decoration, carefully preserved in her childhood home until her mother had donated it to the local museum along with his other military memorabilia. Purple Heart gleamed in the afternoon sunlight streaming through the workshop windows, its bronze surface bearing the profile of George Washington and the inscription for military merit. Martha had always known that Marcus was a veteran, but seeing the physical evidence of his sacrifice made her understand the depth of what he had endured. This wasn't just a medal. It was proof that he had bled for his country, that he had paid a price most people couldn't imagine. When Marcus returned from his ride to town for supplies, he found Martha sitting on the workshop steps, holding the medal case with reverent care. His expression went through several changes as he realized what had happened: embarrassment, resignation, and finally a kind of weary acceptance that his secrets had been discovered. "I'm sorry," Martha said immediately. "I was cleaning and knocked over the box. I didn't mean to go through your private things." Marcus sat down beside her on the steps, his movements careful and deliberate. "It's okay. I don't exactly advertise it, but I'm not ashamed of it either." He took the medal case from her hands, his fingers tracing the familiar outline. "Got this in Kandahar province, Afghanistan. Improvised explosive device took out our convoy. Killed 11 of my brothers and left me with enough shrapnel in my back to set off airport metal detectors for the rest of my life." The matter-of-fact way he spoke about trauma that would have broken most people struck Martha as both heartbreaking and inspiring. She had spent years allowing her own pain to define her, shrinking smaller and smaller until she almost disappeared entirely. But Marcus had taken his wounds and transformed them into strength, used his suffering as fuel for protecting others. "Were you the only survivor?" she asked quietly, Yeah. The single word carried the weight of survivor's guilt that had driven him to the edge of self-destruction more than once. 12 of us went out that morning. Only one came back. For a long time, I couldn't figure out why I deserved to live when better men than me didn't make it home. Martha understood that feeling in ways she couldn't fully articulate. She had spent years wondering why she deserved the life Ray had forced on her, why she couldn't find the courage that other women seemed to possess naturally. The difference was that Marcus had channeled his pain into purpose, while she had allowed hers to become a prison. "I used to write poetry," Martha said suddenly, surprising herself with the admission. "Before Ray, before everything fell apart. I had notebooks full of poems about teaching, about the children I worked with, about dreams I had for the future." She laughed bitterly. "Ray found them one day and burned them all. Said poetry was for people who couldn't deal with the real world." Marcus turned to study her face, seeing past the fading bruises to the intelligence and creativity that abuse had tried to crush. "What kind of poetry?" "Silly things, mostly. About the way children's faces light up when they finally understand a difficult concept. About the changing seasons in the schoolyard. About hope and growth and all the things I stopped believing in." Martha's voice grew stronger as she spoke, as if giving voice to her memories was helping her reclaim them. "I thought maybe if I could capture beautiful moments in words, I could hold on to them when everything else felt dark." "That doesn't sound silly at all," Marcus said, with the kind of sincerity that made Martha's throat tighten with unexpected emotion. "That sounds like someone trying to make sense of the world, trying to find meaning in small moments. That's what kept me sane overseas, actually. Writing letters to my sister, describing the landscape, the people, the way the light looked different in the desert." They sat in comfortable silence for a while, the Purple Heart resting between them like a bridge between their separate experiences of trauma and healing. Both had been broken by circumstances beyond their control. Both had survived when survival seemed impossible, and both were slowly learning that the past didn't have to determine the future. "I want to write again," Martha said finally. "I want to remember who I was before fear took over my life." Marcus smiled, the first completely unguarded expression she had seen from him. "I'd like to read your poems someday, when you're ready to share them." Martha found the teaching certificate in a cardboard box she had brought from her old life, tucked between faded photographs and documents she had managed to save from Ray's periodic purges of her belongings. The certificate was creased and yellowed with age, but the gold seal still gleamed, and the elegant script still proclaimed her qualification to teach elementary education in the state of Arizona. She stared at it for a long moment, remembering the pride she had felt the day she graduated from college, the dreams she had harbored about making a difference in young lives. "I haven't thought about this in years," she murmured, running her fingers over the embossed lettering. Martha Elizabeth Powell, the name read, from before she had become Mrs. Hayes and lost herself in the process. Marcus looked up from the motorcycle engine he was rebuilding at the kitchen table, his hands black with grease, but his attention fully focused on her discovery. "You were a teacher? 3rd grade? I'd loved it more than anything I'd ever done." Martha's voice grew stronger as she spoke, as if the memories were feeding something that had been starved for decades. "There was this little boy named David who couldn't read when the school year started. Everyone said he was just slow, maybe had learning disabilities. But I spent extra time with him, found books about subjects he was interested in. Dinosaurs mostly. By Christmas, he was reading at grade level. The pride in her voice was unmistakable, and Marcus found himself smiling at the transformation taking place before his eyes. This was a glimpse of who Martha had been before abuse had stolen her confidence and joy. What happened to him? I don't know. Ray made me quit teaching after our 2nd year of marriage. Said it was inappropriate for a wife to be spending so much time with other people's children when she should be focused on her own family. Martha's expression darkened with the memory. "We never had children. Ray said it was my fault, that I was defective somehow. But I think he was just afraid that a child might interfere with his control over me. Marcus wiped his hands on a shop rag and moved to sit beside her at the kitchen table. It's not too late, you know. To teach again, I mean. The certificate might be old, but the knowledge and passion are still there. I'm 46 years old, Martha protested. I've been out of the classroom for over 20 years. Everything has changed. Technology, teaching methods, curriculum standards. I wouldn't even know where to start, so you learn, Marcus said simply. You study, you take courses, you volunteer. You remember why you wanted to teach in the first place, and you build from there. He gestured toward the certificate. That piece of paper says you have the foundation. The rest is just updating your tools. The idea terrified and thrilled Martha in equal measure. For so long, she had defined herself by her limitations, by the things Ray had told her she couldn't do. The possibility of reclaiming her professional identity felt like stepping off a cliff into unknown territory, but it also felt like coming home to herself. Over the following weeks, Marcus encouraged her exploration of returning to education with the same patient support he showed for everything else. He drove her to the library in town, where she spent hours researching current teaching methodologies and reading about changes in elementary education. He helped her set up an email account so she could correspond with the state education department about renewing her certification. The motorcycle club members, initially skeptical of Marcus's sudden domestic situation, began to see changes in their brother that even they couldn't deny. Steele had always been reliable, but now there was a lightness in his demeanor that hadn't been there before. He smiled more readily, spoke with greater warmth, and seemed to have found a purpose beyond simple survival. Martha's presence at club gatherings became gradually accepted as the members realized she wasn't trying to change Marcus or drive a wedge between him and his brothers. Instead, she brought out qualities in him that had been buried under years of emotional armor. She listened to their stories with genuine interest, offered practical advice when asked, and demonstrated the kind of quiet strength that earned respect rather than demanded it. One evening, as they sat on the cabin's front porch, watching the sunset paint the mountains in shades of gold and crimson, Martha reached for Marcus's hand with a naturalness that surprised them both. "Thank you," she said quietly. "For what?" "For seeing who I could be instead of who I was." She held up the teaching certificate, now carefully preserved in a protective sleeve. "For helping me remember that I'm more than what happened to me." Marcus squeezed her hand gently, marveling at how this damaged woman had somehow begun to heal not just herself, but something broken inside him as well. Detective Sarah Chen had been investigating domestic violence cases for 12 years, but the police file folder she carried up the mountain road to Marcus's cabin contained some of the most disturbing evidence she had encountered in her career. The manila folder was thick with reports, photographs, and witness statements that painted a picture of systematic abuse spanning multiple relationships and potentially multiple victims. Martha's hands shook as she opened the folder on the kitchen table, Marcus standing protectively behind her chair. The first document was a missing person report filed in 1994 for a woman named Linda Sue Hayes, Ray's first wife. Martha stared at the photograph of a young blonde woman with kind eyes and a nervous smile, realizing with growing horror that she was looking at her predecessor. "Linda Hayes disappeared 3 years after marrying your husband," Detective Chen explained gently. "Her family reported her missing when she failed to show up for her sister's wedding. Ray claimed she had run off with another man, but there were inconsistencies in his story that bothered the investigating officers." Martha flipped through crime scene photographs showing signs of a struggle in Ray's previous home, blood evidence that had been hastily cleaned, and witness statements from neighbors who had heard screaming the night before Linda's disappearance. The similarities to her own experience were chilling. The isolation, the progressive escalation of violence, the systematic destruction of the victim support network. They never found her body, Detective Chen continued. Ray moved to Arizona 6 months later and met you within a year. The pattern fits what we call domestic homicide progression. The abuse escalates until the victim either escapes or is killed. You escaped, Martha. Linda didn't. Marcus's hands clenched into fists as he read over Martha's shoulder. The military training that had taught him to assess threats and eliminate them was screaming warnings about the danger Ray represented. This wasn't just about a controlling husband trying to reclaim his wife. This was about a serial predator who had escalated to murder once before and wouldn't hesitate to do so again. There's more, Detective Chen said grimly. We've identified 2 other women who were involved with Ray between his first wife and you. Both reported domestic violence incidents. Both disappeared from their communities after filing restraining orders. We think Ray has been killing women for over 20 years. Martha felt the room spinning around her as the full scope of her danger became clear. She had always known Ray was dangerous, but she had thought his violence was personal, directed specifically at her because of something she had done or failed to do. The realization that she was simply the latest in a series of victims, that her suffering had been part of a larger pattern of predation, left her feeling sick and terrified. Why didn't anyone stop him? Martha whispered, staring at photographs of women who could have been her sisters, all sharing the same haunted expression she recognized from her own mirror. Because he was careful, Detective Chen explained. He chose isolated women without strong family connections or financial resources. He moved frequently, changed his identity slightly each time, and until recently different jurisdictions didn't always communicate effectively. But domestic violence cases, the file contained evidence that would have convicted Ray of multiple crimes if the authorities had been able to connect the dots earlier. Financial records showing he had collected life insurance policies on at least 2 of his victims. Witness statements placing him near the locations where the women had last been seen. Medical records documenting injuries consistent with systematic abuse. We need your testimony to build a case, Detective Chen said. You're the only victim who survived long enough to identify the pattern. Your evidence, combined with what we've gathered about his previous crimes, could finally put him away for life. Martha looked at Marcus, seeing her own fear and determination reflected in his steel-grey eyes. The man who had claimed her in a roadside bar had unknowingly rescued her from a serial killer who had been planning her murder for years. The realization was both terrifying and liberating. She was no longer just a victim trying to escape an abusive marriage. She was a survivor with the power to ensure that no other woman would suffer Linda's fate. What do I need to do? Martha asked, her voice growing stronger with each word. Detective Chen smiled for the first time since arriving at the cabin. Tell the truth, all of it. Help us build a case that will keep Ray Hayes from ever hurting another woman. The police file folder lay open on the table between them, its contents representing not just evidence of past crimes, but hope for future justice. Martha's survival had become more than personal victory. It had become the key to stopping a killer. The subpoena papers arrived 3 days after Detective Chen's visit, delivered by a nervous courier who clearly understood he was venturing into dangerous territory. The legal documents were crisp and official, bearing the seal of the Superior Court of Arizona and language that made Martha's stomach clench with anxiety. The papers demanded her appearance as a key witness in the state's case against Raymond Michael Hayes for murder in the first degree, conspiracy to commit murder, and multiple counts of domestic violence. Martha stared at the subpoena with the same expression she might have worn when facing a loaded gun. The document represented both salvation and potential destruction, offering the chance to ensure Ray could never hurt another woman, while simultaneously painting a target on her back that would be visible from space. Her hands trembled as she read the court date, just 6 weeks away. Enough time for Ray to learn about her testimony and take action to prevent it. You don't have to do this alone, Marcus said quietly. reading the tension in her posture from across the cabin's main room. He had been cleaning his service pistol when the courier arrived, a ritual that had become more frequent since Detective Chen's revelations about Ray's history. The weapon lay disassembled on a towel, its components gleaming with careful maintenance. "If I testify, he'll know where I am," Martha said, voicing the fear that had been growing since she first opened the police file. "Court records are public. My name will be in the newspapers. Everyone will know that I'm the woman who got away. And Ray will do everything in his power to make sure I don't get the chance to speak." Marcus set down the gun barrel he had been inspecting and moved to sit beside her on the couch. His presence was steady and reassuring, but even his protective instincts couldn't eliminate the very real danger that testimony would bring. Detective Chen said they could provide protection. Federal marshals, safe house, new identity if necessary. "And what about you?" Martha asked, meeting his eyes directly. "What about your life here, your business, your club? If I disappear into witness protection, you lose everything you've built. If I stay and testify, you become a target too." The question hung in the air between them, like smoke from a distant fire. Marcus had spent 6 years building a life in these mountains, establishing relationships with his Hell's Angels brothers, creating a sanctuary where he could heal from the wounds of war. Choosing to protect Martha meant potentially sacrificing all of that, trading his hard-won peace for a life of constant vigilance and danger. But as Marcus looked at the subpoena papers, he realized the choice had been made weeks ago in a roadside bar when he had claimed Martha as his wife. The vows he had spoken that night hadn't been legally binding, but they had been morally absolute. He had promised to protect her, and that promise transcended personal convenience or safety. "My military contacts might be useful," Marcus said finally, his voice carrying the calm certainty that had made him a natural leader in combat situations. "I know people in federal law enforcement, former Marines who work in witness protection. We might have options that Detective Chen hasn't mentioned." Martha felt a surge of gratitude mixed with guilt. This man who owed her nothing was willing to risk everything to ensure she could seek justice for herself and the women who hadn't survived Ray's violence. The depth of his commitment both humbled and frightened her, adding another layer of responsibility to an already overwhelming situation. "There's something else," Martha said, her voice barely above a whisper. "The prosecutor wants me to wear a wire to try to get Ray to confess to Linda's murder. They think if they can get him talking about what happened to her, it will strengthen the case against him." The suggestion was simultaneously brilliant and suicidal. Ray's ego and need to maintain control might indeed drive him to boast about his crimes, especially if he thought he was speaking to a woman he considered his property. But the danger of such an operation was enormous, requiring Martha to put herself within striking distance of a man who had already killed multiple times. Marcus was quiet for a long moment, his tactical mind working through scenarios and contingencies. "If you decide to do this, we do it right. Professional equipment, backup surveillance, extraction plan if things go wrong. And we make sure Ray never gets the chance to hurt you again, regardless of what he says on tape." The subpoena papers lay on the coffee table between them, representing a crossroads that would determine not just their future together, but the fate of other women who might cross Ray's path. Martha's decision would ripple outward in ways she couldn't fully predict, potentially saving lives while risking her own. The phone call came at 4 a.m, jarring Marcus awake with the kind of urgency that triggered his combat instincts before his conscious mind had fully engaged. Detective Chen's voice was tight with controlled panic as she delivered news that changed everything. Ray Hayes had escaped from county lockup during a prisoner transport, overpowering 2 guards and disappearing into the Arizona desert with help from associates who had been waiting along the route. Marcus reached for the combat knife on his nightstand, the familiar weight of the military-issue blade grounding him in the reality of immediate danger. The knife had saved his life more than once in Afghanistan. Its 7-inch carbon steel blade, honed to surgical sharpness and balanced for both utility and combat. He had hoped never to need it for close quarters fighting again, but Ray's escape had transformed their mountain sanctuary into a potential battlefield. "How long has he been gone?" Marcus asked, already moving toward the bedroom door to check on Martha. 6 hours. "We've got roadblocks up, helicopters searching, but he knows this area better than we initially realized. And Marcus, there's something else. Ray had visitors in jail, men with criminal records, who were asking questions about your location. We think he's been planning this escape for weeks." Martha woke to find Marcus pulling on tactical clothing he hadn't worn since leaving the Marines, his movements efficient and purposeful in the pre-dawn darkness. The man who had been gentle and patient with her healing was transforming before her eyes into the warrior he had been before civilian life softened his edges. But there was nothing soft about him now. "Ray's escaped," Marcus explained, strapping the combat knife to his thigh with practiced ease. "He's coming here probably with help. We need to be ready." The next hour passed in a blur of preparation that revealed the depth of Marcus's military training and tactical thinking. He contacted Roadkill and the other Hells Angels members, using coded language that conveyed both the nature of the threat and the assistance he needed. Within 40 minutes, the sound of approaching motorcycles announced the arrival of his brotherhood. Armed and ready to defend one of their own, the cabin's defensible position became immediately apparent as Marcus walked the perimeter with his club brothers, identifying fields of fire, escape routes, and potential ambush points. Years of combat experience had taught him to read terrain like a language, and the mountain setting offered both advantages and vulnerabilities that needed to be addressed before Ray's arrival. Tank and Wolf began setting up defensive positions, using their own military backgrounds to complement Marcus's tactical planning. Preacher worked on communications, establishing contact with Detective Chen's team and coordinating with federal agents who were finally taking the threat seriously. Diesel and the other members secured the approaches to the cabin, creating obstacles that would slow any assault while providing cover for the defenders. Martha watched the preparations with a mixture of awe and terror. These men, who had seemed dangerous but essentially peaceful during her previous encounters with them, were revealing themselves as a disciplined fighting force, with the kind of cohesion that came from shared experience and absolute trust. They moved with the efficiency of soldiers, but their motivation was personal rather than professional. "You don't have to stay," Marcus told her as he checked the action on a rifle that had emerged from a hidden cache in his workshop. "Detective Chen can get you to a safe house. Put you in protective custody until this is over." Martha looked at the combat knife on his belt, understanding that he was preparing to fight and possibly die to protect her. The man who had claimed her in a roadside bar was willing to wage war against her demons, to risk everything he had built for a woman he had known for less than 2 months. The depth of his commitment both humbled and strengthened her. "I'm not running anymore," Martha said with conviction that surprised them both. "Ray has controlled my life through fear for 23 years. If this is where it ends, then this is where I make my stand." Marcus studied her face in the growing dawn light, seeing a strength there that hadn't existed when he first met her. The broken woman from the Crossroads bar had been replaced by someone who understood her own worth and was willing to fight for it. The transformation was remarkable, but it also meant she would be in danger when Ray arrived. The combat knife caught the first rays of sunlight streaming through the cabin windows, its blade reflecting the determination of a man who had found something worth protecting again. Outside, the Hells Angels took their positions, ready to defend their brother's chosen family with the same loyalty they would show for blood relatives. Ray Hayes was coming, and they would be ready for him. As the sun reached its zenith over the mountain peaks, Marcus pulled Martha aside to a quiet spot behind the cabin where wildflowers grew in defiant clusters between the pine trees. In his weathered hand, he held a simple silver ring that had belonged to his grandmother, a woman who had waited through 2 wars for the men she loved to come home safely. The ring was unadorned but beautiful in its simplicity, worn smooth by decades of faithful wear and polished by countless anxious moments when its owner had twisted it while praying for protection. "I know the timing isn't ideal," Marcus said, his voice carrying the weight of a man who understood that some promises couldn't wait for perfect circumstances. "But if we're going to face whatever's coming, I want to do it as your husband. Really your husband, not just some stranger who made a claim in a bar." Martha felt tears gathering in her eyes as she looked at the ring, understanding the significance of what Marcus was offering. This wasn't a desperate gesture born from immediate danger, but a commitment that transcended the crisis they faced. He was choosing her not just for today, but for whatever future they might build together if they survived the coming confrontation. "I don't have anything to give you in return," Martha whispered, suddenly aware of how little she possessed, beyond the clothes Marcus's sister had left behind and the few personal items she had managed to save from her previous life. Marcus smiled and touched the wooden cross that hung from a chain around her neck, the same cross her grandfather had carved for her grandmother during the hardest years of the Depression. "You're giving me yourself." "That's more than I ever thought I deserved." Roadkill emerged from the cabin, carrying a worn leather Bible that had seen more road miles than most people's cars, its pages marked with passages that had provided comfort during the darkest moments of various club members' lives. The chapter president's weathered face was serious but warm as he approached the couple, understanding the importance of this moment despite the chaos surrounding them. "Never thought I'd be performing a wedding ceremony with snipers in the trees," Roadkill said with dry humor. "But I've been ordained since '92, and desperate times call for creative solutions." The other Hell's Angels gathered in a loose circle around the couple, their weapons within easy reach, but their attention focused on the simple ceremony taking place in their midst. These men who lived outside conventional societies' rules understood the power of vows spoken between people who had chosen each other against all odds. Martha's hand shook as Marcus slipped the silver ring onto her finger, the metal cool against her skin but warming quickly to her body temperature. The ring fit perfectly, as if it had been waiting for her all along. She looked into Marcus's steel-grey eyes and saw not just love, but absolute commitment, the kind of devotion that would endure whatever trials lay ahead. "I, Marcus Thompson, take you, Martha Hayes, to be my wife," he said, his voice carrying across the mountain clearing with quiet authority. "I promise to protect you, to honor you, and to stand by your side through whatever comes. In war and peace, in darkness and light, until death parts us." Martha's voice was stronger than she expected as she repeated vows that felt more binding than any legal document. "I, Martha Hayes, take you, Marcus Thompson, to be my husband. I promise to trust you, to support you, and to build a life worthy of the love you've shown me. Through fear and hope, through struggle and joy, until death parts us." Roadkill pronounced them husband and wife with the solemnity usually reserved for funeral services, understanding that these vows were being spoken in the shadow of potential tragedy. When Marcus kissed his new bride, the assembled bikers offered restrained applause, their celebration muted by the awareness that enemy forces were approaching their position. The silver wedding ring caught the afternoon sunlight as Martha adjusted to its presence on her finger, replacing the tarnished band that had symbolized years of bondage and fear. This ring represented choice rather than obligation, partnership rather than ownership, love rather than control. It was a circle of protection that no amount of violence could break. As the couple rejoined the defensive preparations, Martha felt a strength she had never known before. She was no longer just a victim trying to escape her past, or a woman dependent on others for salvation. She was Martha Thompson, wife to a warrior, partner to a protector, and active participant in determining her own destiny. The silver ring gleamed on her finger as she helped prepare ammunition and medical supplies, a tangible reminder that love could flourish even in the darkest circumstances. Whatever Ray brought to their mountain sanctuary, he would find not a cowering victim, but a woman who had reclaimed her power and surrounded herself with people willing to fight for her freedom. Ray. Hayes arrived at the mountain cabin just as the sun began its descent behind the western peaks, his pickup truck grinding up the access road with the determination of a man who had burned every bridge behind him. He wasn't alone. 3 other men rode with him, hard-faced criminals who owed him favors or shared his hatred of women who dared to defy male authority. In the truck bed, among coils of rope and other instruments of violence, lay the broken remains of an empty whiskey bottle, its amber glass catching the dying light like fragments of shattered promises. The bottle had once contained the top-shelf bourbon that Ray had demanded in exchange for Martha at the Crossroads bar, the same liquor that had fueled his rage for so many years. Now it lay in pieces, destroyed during his violent escape from custody when he had used it as a weapon against one of the transport guards. The broken glass seemed fitting somehow, a symbol of everything Ray touched being reduced to dangerous fragments. Marcus watched through binoculars from a concealed position as Ray's truck approached the cabin's defensive perimeter. The military training that had kept him alive through 2 combat tours was fully engaged now, his mind calculating distances, assessing threats, and preparing for the kind of close-quarters battle he had hoped never to fight again. But this wasn't Afghanistan, and the people he was protecting weren't fellow Marines. This was personal in a way that made every tactical decision crystal clear. 4 men, armed, approaching from the south, Marcus reported into his radio, alerting the Hells Angels positioned around the cabin's perimeter. Ray's driving, unknown subjects in the passenger seats. They're not trying to be subtle. Ray's strategy, if it could be called that, was based on arrogance and desperation rather than tactical thinking. He believed that overwhelming force and surprise would be enough to reclaim what he considered his property. He had no idea that he was walking into a carefully prepared kill zone, defended by men who had fought real wars against trained enemies. Martha watched from the cabin window as her former husband emerged from the truck, his movements betraying the alcohol and adrenaline that were driving his actions. Even at this distance, she could see the familiar signs of his rage. The red face, the clenched fists, the way he moved like a man barely containing explosive violence. But for the first time in 23 years, the sight of Ray's anger didn't fill her with terror. She was no longer alone and defenseless. "Martha!" Ray's voice carried across the mountain clearing, slurred with drink and thick with menace. "I know you're in there, you worthless whore. Time to come home and face what you've done. You made vows, remember? Till death do us part." The words that had once paralyzed Martha with fear now struck her as pathetic. This man who had controlled her life through intimidation and violence looked smaller somehow, diminished by the mountain setting and the certain knowledge that his reign of terror was ending. She touched the silver wedding ring on her finger, drawing strength from its promise of protection and partnership. Marcus's voice came through her earpiece, calm and professional despite the deadly situation developing outside. "Stay low, stay quiet. This ends today, but it ends on our terms." Ray began walking toward the cabin, his companions spreading out in what they probably thought was a tactical formation, but which actually exposed them to crossfire from multiple positions. Their overconfidence would be their downfall, but Marcus took no satisfaction in the tactical advantage. He had seen too much death to enjoy the prospect of more violence, even when it was necessary and justified. The confrontation that followed was swift and decisive. Ray's assault on the cabin triggered a defensive response that demonstrated the difference between desperate criminals and trained warriors. The Hells Angels moved with coordinated precision, their military backgrounds allowing them to end the threat with minimal risk to themselves or collateral damage to the surrounding area. When the shooting stopped, Ray lay motionless beside the broken whiskey bottle that had symbolized his power over Martha for so many years. The glass fragments were stained now with blood instead of bourbon, and Martha felt a profound sense of closure as she looked down at the man who had stolen so much of her life. "It's over," Marcus said quietly, pulling her close as federal agents swarmed the scene to secure evidence and process the aftermath. "He can't hurt you anymore." "He can't hurt anyone anymore," Martha nodded, her eyes fixed on the broken bottle that had started this entire journey. Ray's attempt to trade her for whiskey had led directly to his own destruction, a kind of poetic justice that even her grandmother's faith couldn't have scripted more perfectly.